Welcome and thanks for joining the Strategic Account Management Association today for the SAMA webinar series. And today's webinar is Dealing with External Procurement Consultants with Andy Morehouse from Huthwaite International. I'm Tony Monfrestelli with SAMA, and I'll be moderating the session today. And let's get underway. So let you know a little bit about our speaker today. Andy Morehouse is a research consultant with Huthwaite International, an international sales and negotiation consultancy. Andy is a frequent and highly rated contributor to SAMA events and publications. And Andy, it is good to have you with us today.
Hi there, Tony. Well, thanks for the introduction. So for the next 55 minutes, I'm going to share some insights from the first ever research study that looked at what the successful SAM organizations are doing differently when dealing with external procurement consultants. Now, through our global research study, we found that there are certain strategies that vastly help to improve win rates. The successful companies are all doing something differently, but their success stories are very rarely shared outside their immediate business division and hardly ever shared outside the organization. So today's webinar is a great opportunity to learn about how other organizations are adapting their sales approach to this new procurement-dominated environment. So you can learn from their collective experience, and hopefully you're going to take away a few strategies that will improve your win rates. Now, to keep things lively, I'm going to share some of the data, some of the research insights, and I'll try and bring that to life with a real-world case study example. I've presented at a number of different SAMA events, and I feel the real value in attending the SAMA events is the opportunity to share war stories within the room. Now, it's a little bit difficult to try and do on a webinar, but I'm going to try anyway. So I'm going to maybe do my slides in about 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, depends on the number of questions. And then at the end, we're going to have 15 minutes. We'll open up the phone lines for Q&A, and also an opportunity for you to share your experience. If we need to go past the hour mark, the call is being recorded, so if you need to hang up, that's no problem. But we'll keep going until everybody's had their say. And again, throughout this presentation, please don't keep your questions until the end. If something needs clarifying or I didn't do a good job explaining, please jump in using that Q&A tab at the top and ask your question. So before we dive into the research, let's start with a definition. What do we mean by external procurement consultant? Well, we have a large range of different industry sectors represented on this call. So that term might mean different things to different people. We've got IT, facilities management, people from global hotel chains, we've got logistics organizations, we've got pharmaceutical firms. So I'll give you an example. Let's say one of the big oil companies, one of the oil super majors, and they want to invest in a new ERP computer system that links up all of their different parts of the organization across the world. Now, this would be perhaps a billion-dollar, a multi-billion-dollar project. So they could give that project to their in-house procurement team. They could also give it to their in-house IT team. But the reality is that both groups probably don't have the experience in making such a purchase, and certainly they don't have the spare time to project manage this thing. So increasingly what you find is the big organization will hire in a specialist procurement consultancy who will bring along a very robust and a very rigorous process to run the show. Anyway, that's my definition. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's a definition from the global bid manager at Vodafone. And the issue here is this rigorous, robust process that the consultants bring. Now, in his world, the people he sees are organizations like TPI, Technology Partners International, and the other firms there. And as we did the research, it became apparent that there are a lot of industry specialists. So within logistics, you have specialist logistics consultancies. Turner and Townsend, they do quite a lot there, and also just in the construction sectors, but they don't do, IT projects. Healthcare, you have your own specialist procurement sourcing consultants. And if you take TPI on that list here, Technology Partners International, they, and talking about, rigorous, robust methodology, they have a 350-step sourcing process. A 350-step sourcing process, and it took them 10 years to develop it. So you can imagine for the bid manager at Vodafone, it's a real pain to go through that process. But TPI probably are doing something right. Their last 500 deals have a collective revenue of $330 billion. So the average deal size is about $1.5 billion. Now, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, for the avoidance of doubt, in the context of this session, I'm not talking about third-party procurement consolidators that try and aggregate spend from a number of different suppliers. So it does happen in hotel chains, so just want to make sure everyone's on the same page that in terms of procurement consultants, it's as per the definition I gave. Now, Tony, let's try and share the experience of people on the call. Could you pull up that first poll that we put together?
Okay, Andy. Here's a poll for everybody, and everybody gets one vote, and we'd like to know how you feel, kind of setting aside logic and business considerations. We're going to ask you about your feelings here. How do you feel when a potential client hires an external procurement consultant to work with you? And everybody gets one vote. We're going to get a sense of where the audience stands on this. So the polls are open. You can go ahead and click there and click in your vote, and we'll leave the polls open here for about another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's go ahead and close the polls on that, and let's go ahead and show the results. And there they are, Andy.
Right. Well, I guess, to be honest, that's kind of what we were hoping for. If everybody was very excited and delighted to be working with them, then it'd be quite strange why they actually signed up for this webinar. So I'm probably right in thinking that most people have signed up for this because it is a bit of a frustrating situation. They're either somewhat frustrated or incredibly frustrated by these external procurement consultants. And perhaps there's people who haven't dealt with them, but are thinking, well, it might happen to me soon. I spoke to a number of big partners in law firms, and it's something which is on the horizon. They're not really facing it yet today, but it's on the horizon. So there are perhaps some people who are wanting to learn a little more about this. So let's move back to the presentation and perhaps look at, why is it such a problem? Why are external procurement such an issue? And why did we spend 6 months doing a research project? Well, I'll pull up another quote from someone who participated in the research. This is the senior bid manager at a large IT firm. So in the last year, 8 of their last 10 deals he's worked on, he faced third-party consultants, and they lost every single one. And as I indicated before, the deal size is often quite large. Collectively, $2.5 billion potential revenue they lost. And the scary thing is, a year on from their internal investigation, bid loss, win-loss reviews, this type of stuff, they don't really know what's going wrong. In fact, I spoke to people in many different organizations who almost blame their losses on the presence of external consultants. I interviewed a sales director from one of the big facilities management organizations, and he said, I've got the quote here, I'll just read out. He said, we've won 0 out of 5 opportunities because the traditional methods of relationship building don't work. And he was almost complaining. He said, none of these guys want to be my friend. Look, they don't want a relationship. None of the people I've met want to get close to me. Someone else we interviewed as part of this project was the director of global account operations at one of the big printing technology companies. And he shared their win-loss review data. And he estimates that once the consultant is engaged by the client, he says their win rate drops down from 1 in 2 down to 1 in 10. So some pretty hideous success factors, some pretty hideous win rates going on there. But of course, somebody has to win the deal. So what we wanted to find out was, what are the successful organizations doing differently? So as part of this research, we spent 3 months conducting 82 very, very in-depth interviews with mostly sales directors. And because they'd all participated in more than one deal with an external consultant, so we're able to put together a database of 262 different case study examples. I also interviewed a number of different procurement consultancies too, to try and get the view from the other side. Now, in terms of the people that participated, there is a bit of a bias towards what I'm going to share today. It's IT and technology organizations. But that's probably down to the fact that you see more procurement consultants in that sector than any other. So in terms of people who participated, IT consulting, professional services, and technology firms made up nearly 2/3 of the interview database. But you can see that the sectors there. I don't need to read them out. And if anybody wants any more specific information, I can always share that later on. In terms of the size of companies, we specifically targeted the largest companies in the world for this research. So 63% of people who shared their insights, they're in companies with revenue greater than $5 billion. So I looked through the list of people who were signed on for this call earlier today, and I guess that really reflects your world. So you can perhaps be reassured that the strategies I'm going to share are what we've seen working within the world's largest organizations. So, Tony, just before we move on and look at perhaps the 5 success factors, do we have any Q&A? I can't see any in the top bar. Are there any questions at all?
We don't have any questions yet, and I would just like to remind everyone that Andy will address all your questions and your comments. I suppose there might be maybe a few war stories from people who've been through these situations in the past. And I would like to let you know that if you would like to come on and ask your question or make your comment or maybe even tell your story, a little bit of your story, you can do so if you're dialed in. And I will just post the dial-in there for everybody, just to look at that. If you're on your computer and you would like to dial in and talk to Andy, ask your question, you'll need to dial in to do that. But all questions, if you would submit those through the Q&A tab in the upper middle of your screen there, the Q&A tab will work for that.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Well, we'll try and keep things going, and if we need to stop and have some discussions, that's fine. So this first success factor, I'm going to use the term no-brainer, perhaps, because we like that over in the States. But get involved before the procurement consultants. Long before the client even thinks about hiring an external procurement consultant, something's happening within their organization. There's a compelling event or a shift in requirements. Maybe there's a new CEO, there's some kind of merger, there's an acquisition. There will be some compelling event. And of course, the ultimate goal of strategic account management, if you speak to Bernard, the CEO of SAMA, he's going to tell you that the ultimate goal of a SAM is to remove the bidding process entirely and thus remove the need for an external procurement consultant. We did see one example of that in the research out of the 262 examples. But I spoke with the head of sales in the UK at one of the big IT services organizations, and he shared that 80% of the RFPs that land on their desk are a surprise. So the reality is you may not be able to accurately identify, prevent all of the accounts going to bid, but if you can, get involved before the procurement consultants. And I'm going to share some success rates for companies that do that. So I'm going to pull up this graph, and this will be a consistent structure throughout the presentation. So there's 2 options. There's people who were successful in getting the contract and those who weren't successful. Now, this is just for new suppliers. I'll share the data for incumbents a little bit further on. So for companies that had no executive contact, they hadn't engaged with executive decision makers before the procurement consultant was brought in, on average in our sample, the success rate was 21.4%. So nearly 4 out of 5 times they didn't win the deal. But for those organizations which did establish executive contact, in our sample, the success rate was an incredible 85.7%. Now, this data, although this is about external procurement consultants, although the numbers would be different, this trend probably reflects the general level of engagement with an account, whether it's the in-house procurement team. But of course, it's not the executive contact per se which drives success, but it's really what the sellers are doing at that time. And when client access is unhindered by the consultant, you're able to really understand what's going on, this overt requirement and what's driving, the RFP. You can understand the business drivers in detail. And the critical thing, and I'll just summarize that here, the critical thing was all of the organizations who got in at the early stage attempted to influence the specification. And that's a real critical point, and we'll certainly explore that a little bit later, and I'll share some case studies around that. So what's going wrong when the consultants are involved? Well, it seems that the chance of having access to client executives reduces immediately when the third party is introduced. This is a type of language we've seen in the RFP document. If you go outside the formal process, we're going to disqualify you. And when it's a $40 million deal, an $800 million deal, or even larger, it's a very scary position to be in when you need to engage with client executives to get the information you want, and you're being threatened with disqualification. Now, in our sample, incredibly, 83.6% of the time, access was blocked. Now, just to make sure, perhaps everyone's on the same page, could we share the experience of people on the call? And Tony, could you put up that second poll, please, so we can find out the experience of people on the call?
Okay, everybody, here's the second poll, asking you to what degree you think external procurement consultants block your access to key decision makers at the customer company. And the polls are open. Everybody gets one vote. And we'll give it just a couple more seconds. Polls are still open, and polls are closing in 3, 2, 1. Polls are closed. And let's show the results.
Okay. So apart from one person on the call, everybody has really experienced a procurement consultant when access has been blocked. To varying degrees, and again, we do have a lot of different industries represented on the call, so I guess that's the type of thing we'd expect. So, but it's good though, so most people on the call have experienced that situation when access was blocked. And of course, the critical decision, I think this is what we should explain, perhaps spend the last 15 minutes of the webinar talking about is, what did you do at that time? So if you have a success story to share, please maybe think about that, and we'll get you on the call at the end of the webinar. So just going to flip back to the main presentation. So unsurprisingly, when we crunched the numbers and looked at the success rates, this is again for new suppliers, the success rates, the level of executive contact has a huge effect on success rates. So there's 3 different categories that we saw. The first one, when there was no prior executive contact, but full access was given. So there was unrestricted access to executive decision makers. Now, I must point out, this was very rare. We didn't see many examples of this in our study. But when this happened, the new supplier success rate was 41.8%. But this is where it gets exciting. If there was no prior contact with executive decision makers and access was blocked, and they didn't do anything else about it, within our study, the success rate was 0.4%. Now, there was one unique example, which was from the group sales director from a global hotel chain. Now, I know we have a few people from hotels on the call today, so you may be able to relate to this. Now, he got the RFP and he went back and said, look, I need to speak to the executive decision makers because I need to find out what's really driving their selection decisions. Access was absolutely blocked, and he didn't want to kind of push back against the rules for fear of being disqualified. So he explained that the hotel industry is quite an incestuous business. His words, not mine. And what he did was, they were a four-star chain. He was able to gain some really in-depth insights into this client by going to his peers within the five-star and the budget sectors of the market. So although he didn't get direct client contact, he did get insights from his peers. Now, whether that would work in IT or healthcare, I'm not too sure, but it was quite a unique example. So the reality here is that, when access is blocked, the seller is prevented from really understanding the business drivers and, of course, is prevented from introducing any sort of business value. So the success rate here of 0.4%, virtually zero, is a critical point. Now, of course, sorry, were you going to say something, Tony? No?
No, sir.
Okay, so there is one other option, of course. When access is blocked, you employ a specific strategy to create access. And we'll talk about what that is in a second. And the companies employing this particular tactic enjoyed a 56.3% success rate, so an incredible improvement over 0.4%. Now, how can you get access when you're being threatened with being disqualified? So what we saw, whilst the wording varied, and I'll give you an example from a senior bid manager at a global consulting firm, this is the type of thing they went back and said. So whilst the exact wording varied, the strategy was consistent across every example where they created access. What they're saying is, we need executive access to qualify in this opportunity. We know from past experience, if we cannot speak to executive decision makers, we're not going to win. We know that. So unless we can get access, we're going to walk away. And, threatening to withdraw is obviously a very bold and daring move. But when it was employed in our sample, there was a 100% success rate in getting the required access. Now, they may not have necessarily won the deal, but at least they all got access. And this is a term used by a guy called Philip Squire, who's the CEO of Consalia. He's done a bit of work with HP. And I think there's an article in Velocity a couple of issues ago which talks about this. And HP have identified tactful audacity as a critical success factor in their sales force. So, they want their sellers to be bold. They want their salespeople to be audacious. And when they've taken this type of approach, their win rates have gone up to 67%. So their conversion rate is 2.5 times higher than it used to be. So, when it's a multi-million-dollar deal or a multi-million euro deal, or, we've got people from all over the world on the call, when it's a significant opportunity, it's a very bold and daring move to push back and say, if we can't get access, we're going to walk away. But that's the most effective approach that we saw. Much, much more effective than sneaking around the back of the rules and circumventing the process covertly. So if you employ this tactic, you're creating overt access. Now, in these different SAMA presentations I've given and other conferences, I've perhaps spoken to about 1,600 different salespeople. And I have never, ever come across anybody that's been disqualified for doing something like this. Never. And in fact, I organized a panel of procurement leaders to share some insights at a recent conference in the UK. And this panel of 5 procurement leaders, we had people from Turner and Townsend, Accenture, and buying team, people who used to head up procurement at Barclays Bank, a real senior level panel. And I said to the panel, I said, this is a real big issue for salespeople. Have you ever disqualified anybody by going outside the process and pushing back? And they all looked a bit sheepish. And actually, nobody on this procurement panel has ever disqualified anybody. So this whole, adversarial atmosphere, this environment of fear that's created by this type of language, we're going to disqualify you, is just fake. And I think it's really critical to recognize that, what will the incumbent supplier be doing? Do you think the incumbent will be slavishly following the process and not talking to people? Of course not. They're going to be leveraging all of their internal contacts to try and influence the outcome. And I think the key takeaway is that, it's not a level playing field, and it's really important to recognize this. And if you're a new supplier, again, recognize that the blockage to access will probably benefit competitors that pay no attention to it. So if you're 100% compliant, you're totally following the process to the letter, and another supplier bidding for the business talks to the key decision makers, then you're actually at a competitive disadvantage. I think I'm trying to hammer home that point. And it's perhaps worth also considering that sometimes the procurement consultants, they're not brought in because of their expertise, but perhaps because the client doesn't have time to run this whole procurement sourcing initiative. And again, what we saw through the research was when salespeople couldn't get this access, they would say, we're about to invest a year of our time and perhaps $100,000 worth of bidding costs on responding to your RFP, but we cannot qualify this opportunity unless we can meet client executives to really understand their needs and what's driving their RFP. So again, a very effective strategy, irrespective of the situation. So just to summarize the discussion there. I've not really come across many people who've won business from what's written in the RFP document. You're not going to win a deal based on purely what's in the tender document. And the successful suppliers, they push back. They say we need client access to qualify this opportunity. Now the last one, I can only say based on the advice, based on the data we have from this research, my advice would be if you are still blocked, then walk away, because the success rates are close to 0. It might be different depending on the different industry sector, but from what we saw, that was the case. Now, of course, the best strategy of all is to influence the specification before it's even written. So we discussed briefly what the suppliers are doing, if they get access before the consultant's involved, and the key thing here is to influence the specification. Now, I don't know if any of you have come across a situation like this. This was from an interview with a national account manager, a Dutch account manager for one of the big IT firms. So it was actually it was a very, very large piece of work, and it came from the procurement consultant. And in this case, they decided to walk away and qualify out that opportunity. And credit to HP, they've done a fantastic job. I know it's a slightly derogatory comment from this particular person, but fantastic job to HP for managing to get their specification into the tender document, which I think is the goal of account management. And let's have a look at the success rate for incumbent. What is the success rate if you manage to get your company-specific specification, or if you manage to influence the specification in your favor? So we'll look at 2 different areas for incumbents. If they didn't influence the RFP, in our sample, the retention rate, those that retained the contract, just had a 41% success rate. However, those that influenced the RFP in their favor and were successful had a 100% success rate. Now, of course, conversely, we can conclude if you're bidding on a specification that looks like it's been influenced by the incumbent and you fail to influence it in return, then your chances of success are probably zero. One of the guys I interviewed, he said, bidding in this situation is a bit like poker. If you don't notice the sucker at the table, it's probably you. And I guess there's different ways of doing this. I saw quite a few examples of what we could call worst practice, where an organization heard that they were the incumbent and they heard the account was going to bid, and they kind of offered to help the specification. So the sales director at quite a big professional services firm, an accounting organization, he said, it came to my attention that the client was going to tender for this piece of work. So we got in touch and said, hey, can we come along and bounce some ideas around? And the client said, no, it's okay, we've already bounced around enough ideas, but we'll let you know when the tender comes out. So, there's obviously a right and a wrong way to do this. But if you can't influence the specification, if you're a new supplier, then what can you do? I've got a good example from a global sales director from an IT systems integrator. And in his words, he said, we won something that nobody thought we were going to win. And he explains that, they knocked HP and IBM, in his words, out of the saddle. And what they did was this deal was being run by TPI, and what they managed to do was look at what the client and TPI had asked for, and they got them to consider something else and get it formally added into the evaluation criteria. And it was a big rollout for an IT solution. And of course, one of the critical the critical decision criteria for the client was to have a very robust and a very rigid process around implementation. But the sales director explained, the reason that they won was actually they convinced TPI, who then convinced the client that it would be in the interests of the client to have a more flexible process around implementation. So this particular supplier said, things will probably change. We'll make the necessary change, and then we'll worry about getting paid for it later. And they backed that up with quite a flexible process, with a lot less red tape, a lot less procedure bound, and a lot more responsive than what the competition had. So what they managed to do really was turn the rigorous procedures and processes used by the competition, and actually turn that into a disadvantage for them. And he made implementation flexibility a key decision criterion, so they influence the decision guidelines. Now, at Huthwaite, we've got some different tools and models that can help you plan this kind of thing. So let me know if you'd like to know more, and I can share what we've got. We don't really have time to cover all of that today. But of course, before you can even start trying to, sorry, I'll just summarize that. So I think the incumbents, of course, can enjoy fantastic success rates if they influence the RFP. If you're bidding in this situation, you might be the sucker at the table because your success rate might be 0 if you're a new supplier, and of course influence the decision guidelines. But before you can really start to influence the consultant, you really have to identify what's driving them. I see we haven't got any questions, so I'll just keep going until we get them. So,
Andy, we do have one question that has come in. Would you like to take it now?
Let's go for it, yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is a question about some of your research, and the question is, have you done research on how much it costs, on average, a large company, say over a $5 billion company, to hire an external procurement company?
That's a fantastic question. I think if that came into the computer, we don't know who that's from, but a fantastic question. Let me just quickly look through my notes, because I did make some notes on this. Typically, and if I talk for the IT sector, if you look at one of these big organizations like TPI, they will generally charge around about 2 to 3% of the value of the deal. So if it's a $6 billion IT deal, you know, they're putting in a global computer system for the client. If my maths is correct, then 3% of that is $180 million in fees. And I guess perhaps the thinking behind that is, you know, could you use what Bernard has said, you know, Bernard, the CEO of Sama, convince the customer to remove the bidding process and remove the consultant? I did see one example, and it was a Canadian telecoms company who actually used that approach. And he said, look, you know, we acknowledge you could use an external consultant, but, you know, that's how much we project it's going to cost you. So we'll give you that as a discount off our deal. And they kind of threw in some new technology to try and sweeten the pot a little bit. And actually, that was one example out of all 262 case studies where they managed to convince the customer not to use the external procurement consultant. So as a general rule, for the IT sector, it's about 2 to 3% of the deal. And if you hold on to that thought, because what we're going to share actually in the next couple of slides are how procurement consultants are compensated. If I didn't accurately answer your question, you can always send a follow-up question, and we'll address it. So that really feeds into the next point, and it wasn't planted in the audience, by the way. You know, obviously understand what's driving the consultant, and I think the common perception is that consultants are compensated, you know, they're remunerated solely on cost savings. Well, you know, is it really about price? I guess there's perhaps a good reason for procurement departments to propagate this idea, because if suppliers think that they're only interested in price, then suppliers kind of start irrationally discounting their services to compete. Now, this isn't our research. It's from an organization called Corporate Executive Board, and they have their sales. They also have a procurement division. So from their Procurement Strategy Council, they did a survey involving 200 procurement people, procurement consultants, and 85% of them will only ever accept a fixed fee arrangement. So like the TPI example, whatever it is in healthcare, I don't know, but you know, 2 to 3% tends to be what's understood. So only the smaller players will include what's called a success-based element. So they might get 50% of their fee based on a flat agreed amount, and then 50% might be tied to kind of hitting implementation metrics, that kind of thing. So I think the common perception that they're only compensated on cost savings is a myth which is perhaps worth you know, addressing. I interviewed a guy who runs one of the big logistics consultancies, and he said, you know, what I really want is I want the process to make me look really good. I want this whole sourcing process to show me in a good light, because then I can use it as a good case study to get further work, and I've got a good referral. Of course, I want a good solution to the client, and the supplier has to do a good job. But the key thing for me here is that I want the process to make me look good. And you know, I think it's worth keeping that in the back of your mind. And I interviewed it was a sales manager from a software company in the UK, and you know, we've talked him through some of the insights, and they've changed their approach over the last year, and they've won the last 5 out of 5 opportunities. And he, you know, had a good chat with him, and he said, you know, the first time we got involved with these consultants, our attitude, you know, they were a gatekeeper, and they were there to make our life difficult. And they've really, it's not a process or a strategy per se. They've really tried to change the mindset of the people dealing with them. And he explained, you know, now we look at the situation and say, look, we've got 2 customers. You know, we have to influence both the client and we have to influence the consultant. But before we can influence the consultant, we have to identify their priorities. So if you think about it, if you look at the SAMA events, if you've ever been to one, there's quite a large number of sessions around dealing with the executives. You know, executive conversation, I think, is one of the organizations. And you know, they say, you know, when you're selling to an executive, talk to them in metrics which are meaningful to them, identify their objectives. Well, you have to do exactly the same with these external procurement consultants. So there's some sales manager from the software company. He says, you know, we sit down with them and we say, okay, let's just forget about the project for a second. What is it you're hoping to achieve here? What's your objective? And through that process, the software company, they try to identify, you know, the milestones that the procurement consultant's working to. You know, they're trying to identify the deliverables. How is the customer going to measure the success of the project? How will the consultant be assessed by the customer? And taking this new approach and really not trying to, I guess really trying to align with their priorities has been critical in securing the last 5 deals. And of course, the way you engage with a consultant has a huge effect on the success rate. And again, Tony, can I just check if we have any questions before I move on?
Well, Andy, it occurs to me that, yes, we do have a second question here. And the question is, we experience consultants using outdated baselines that are not realistic or not current realistic economy baselines when setting the expected savings or variables on the deal. Do your studies show anything similar?
Well, certainly, by baselines, I guess if we're talking about, you know, the consultants have done a market benchmarking appraisal or something, are there other benchmarking organizations that you can turn to? So you've got a number of perhaps, you know, your Gartners and all of those type of organizations who perhaps provide more objective benchmarking information. So it's a difficult one when the consultant goes to the client and says, here, you know, we're going to change the process in the packaging factory and we can deliver you X savings. And, you know, you own the packaging factory. And you say, well, actually, you're not accurately understanding all of the different variables which go into making a cardboard box. You can't just condense it down to an Excel spreadsheet and say, here's the projected price per unit. So there's different ways of doing it. One way would be to go to the client and say, you know what, these guys are just talking rubbish. You know, they don't know what they're on about. Their Excel spreadsheets are out of date. But of course, undermining the consultant in front of the client is a strange situation, because remember that either the chief financial officer or the chief procurement officer or someone else in the client has actually signed off on the procurement consultant. So that approach typically isn't that effective. So I'll share an example in a bit about what, when faced with a situation like this, what the head of global account management at one of the big escalator firms did. So I'll share that at the appropriate place in a couple of slides' time. If I haven't answered your question, and if you didn't mean kind of market benchmarking prices, then please clarify that, and I'll try and answer that where appropriate.
Okay.
So yeah.
We have another just sort of a comment coming over the transom here, and it's from someone who says that he used to teach negotiations both on the procurement side and the sales side at a large company, and he had asked on the procurement side, you know, what the salespeople they liked the best, you know, on their side, and the consistent response was they like the salespeople the best who believe us when we tell them it's the price. If they believe the price, you know, those are the ones we like the best.
Absolutely, and they have a good reason to kind of reinforce the mindset that it's all about price, because you start to see quite irrational. You know, if you think you have no differentiator apart from price, what are you going to do? You're going to try and discount your offering to secure the deal. So, in a way, you know, there may not be quite upfront. I mean, on a slightly different topic, and we've done a SAMA webinar about a year ago on this. We did another large-scale study on reverse auctions. If you haven't all been involved in one, it's where it's like an online bidding system where people are bidding downwards in price against each other in order to try and secure the deal. But the reality was just 13% of these reverse auctions are ever awarded or guaranteed to go to the first-place bidder. Procurement are actually saying, you know, we reserve the right to award the contract to anybody. So we have a huge other piece of research on that. But the reality is, yes, it's not all about price, but that's the mindset that perhaps procurement try to reinforce. So I'm going to move on because I do want to make sure we have time for the Q&A at the end, and obviously to get a bit of a discussion going. And as I said, we can extend it past the hour if we need to do so. So before you can really start to influence the consultant, you have to really try and align with their priorities and get them on side. Sorry, we've just jumped through one of the slides there. So the fifth success factor is really the type of approach that you make and how you engage with the procurement consultant. Here's an example from one rather unsuccessful bid manager. Excuse the profanity if anyone's particularly offended by that. But this is the mindset of many people. And of course, if the procurement consultant sits between you and the client and they block access, it's a very, very frustrating situation. This is actually the guy we shared the example of at the beginning. So he's collectively lost $2.5 billion with this particular mindset and particular approach. I don't know if he's still in his job. I haven't checked in the last year, but he might not be. So, of course, there's different ways to handle these procurement guys, procurement consultants. And there's three different types of approaches that we saw. And perhaps, understandably, the adversarial approach overall has a very, very low success rate. If perhaps this is your common mindset, if you're not doing particularly well when dealing with procurement consultants, this is perhaps where things are going wrong. However, when we looked into all of these case studies, a neutral strategy, you could perhaps translate that as being 100% compliant, but not doing anything particularly outside the rules. So you're just being followed by the rules, head down, following the process. Again, a very unsuccessful strategy. And I think the key thing here is to try and position the consultant as your partner, not your adversary. So the success rate within our sample here, for those who took an approach where they basically tried to make the consultant look good in front of the clients. Now, I wish I could have a catchy title to kind of encapsulate that strategy, but I'll give you an example instead because I can't capture that in a couple of words. So this is the example from the Director of Global Account Management at this lift and escalator company. So in 30 to 40% of the deals they face external consultants. And he said, we had a deal, we thought it was going very well, and then halfway through the process, the client brought in a procurement consultant and actually said, this is the specification you need. What the client had was wrong, and here's the, the super duper specification, recommendation, which was a lot, in his words, was way more than what was needed. And again, rather than going to the client and saying, this specification is just terrible, it's not what you want, this particular director of GAM, he said, we didn't try and play the consultant out of the game or position them as our adversary or our enemy. They went back to the procurement consultant and they basically said, look, you're such an expert and there's probably some very deep thoughts behind what you're thinking, but we don't know them, so we can't quote further unless we can really understand what's going on. And he said, if you position the consultant as your enemy, it's really self-fulfilling prophecy, but you must realize these guys have a role to play. So they've got two golden rules. Number one is they will never, ever accept, just a discussion with the consultant. So if the consultant blocks access, they will threaten to walk away and, every time they get access. But the one relevant to this point, he said, we never try and play the consultant out of the game. We treat them as a partner. We position ourselves as a company that welcomes external procurement consultants. We know they're not going to go away. In fact, their influence is only going to increase. So we've really tried to change our culture and mindset around the way we deal with them. And our strategy really is to try and influence the consultant to make a recommendation to the customer. So we're using them really to prescribe our solution to the customer. Someone else in the research said, consultants have very big egos and you have to try and find ways to massage them. Something relevant for perhaps one of the facilities management companies on the call. I interviewed the director at a leading FM company, and they've actually just hired an employee of one of the big consultancies to get insights into upcoming deals. So they've actually hired an employee from XPS, and you may have come across them, Exchanging Procurement Services, one of the big players in the facilities management field. So now they have inside intel on all of the upcoming deals, and actually they've just won a deal with a big aerospace organization, which wasn't even on their radar. So there are subtle ways of doing things. I guess if you're bidding for a new piece of work in the Navy, you perhaps go and hire an old Navy captain. So, you know, you have to have quite a clear strategy of how you're going to deal with these guys, because the reality is they're not going to go away. So I'll just summarize that section, then we'll perhaps summarize the whole presentation. So, you know, never forget who's paying for the consultant, but treat them as a second customer, not the enemy, and try and make them, you know, convince them you're the right provider, but try and make them look good in the process. And, you know, it's difficult to summarize really about the key strategies because every deal is different, but I'm going to try to do that anyway. So, now the key success factors, you know, you will improve your win rates if you can, you know, I don't need to read this off, but these are the key strategies that you need to do. The key one here, of course, is when you are blocked, do something different. Try and employ what Consalia calls, you know, tactful audacity. I wish I'd coined that phrase, but I'm a bit too late. So, you know, this is the type of thing you need to be doing. And, you know, if you're leading a sales organization, it's quite difficult to say, oh, procurement consultants are our friend, you know, you should be on side with them. But maybe you can use some of the research we've shared here today to try and drive change in your organization. And if you want to know more, if you want some help, perhaps, you know, come and talk to Huthwaite. So I didn't leave quite as much time as I'd promised for the Q&A, but we can run over. If there are any questions, or if you need my details, there they are. And I'll hand over to you, Tony, to moderate the Q&A session.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, well, the first thing I'm noticing is that we have fewer questions coming over the transom in this session than we've had in previous webinars, and it occurs to me that this may be a difficult subject to talk about in the webinar format. It might be a subject that people are more comfortable talking about offline in small groups, and I can think of a few ways to get that started. First is to contact Andy, and you can see Andy's contact information here. And from that, I'll go ahead and go to the evaluation form. For anyone who needs to leave the webinar, this form is to evaluate the webinar, to give us some feedback, and it's completely anonymous, and it gives us real good feedback, and Andy and us at SAMA will all be eager to see your feedback on this. A few other things, you know, we're doing some things on as far as getting groups together offline on LinkedIn. SAMA has a group on LinkedIn, and you can look for the Strategic Account Management Association group and join that group on linkedin.com. SAMA is also on Twitter, twitter.com/SAMA tweet. And, of course, SAMA's website to get started with the conversation is strategicaccounts.org. If your company is a corporate member of SAMA, you can call SAMA and we will tell us your situation, and we will put you together, find a peer, someone who's in the same situation as you. Business-wise, and with these procurement situations, someone who you can learn from one-on-one if your company is a corporate member of SAMA. And with that, I do have a question for you, Andy. What would you think of perhaps creating a group offline, and creating a group offline that of folks around SAMA and who talk about these issues?
I think that would be wonderful. I'm reasonably active in a couple of different associations where I present, and I think, you know, a community of interest where like-minded people from around the world sign up for perhaps a monthly or a bi-monthly maybe conference call, so we can share topics. Maybe we have a predefined topic or something. I would love to perhaps chair and try and facilitate such a call. So if perhaps if that's the way to go, maybe we can get that going. We'll also be doing a couple of quite exciting sessions at the SAMA European Conference. It's in our hometown of London this year.
Right.
So on the Sunday afternoon, we've organised a procurement panel. So we're going to get 4 or 5 different procurement leaders, again with real experience at blue chip organisations. And that, it's going to be like in a conversation, a Q&A discussion with procurement leaders. You can ask them your real hot topics. You can say to them, the evaluation matrix. Do you really use that, or do you make it on a gut decision? So we'll have a good session there. And then for the more basic strategic account managers, we're going to run a 3-hour workshop, I think on the Monday or the Tuesday. It will be how to integrate some of this stuff into your world. And we're going to make it really exciting with live role plays, and it'll be a good fun workshop.
And that's February 28th through March 2nd in London. That's the SAMA Pan-European Conference that Andy's talking about. And while we were talking, there was another question that came in here, Andy. Have you found out that consultants are required to provide the results to all participants in the RFP process? Is that a general practice?
Well, I guess it depends what we mean by results. I think if I can perhaps take my interpretation on that, you can maybe clarify that if I'm going down the wrong track. But let's say, perhaps if this is around the Q&A discussion, so if you get executive access, are the consultants then required to give executive access to everybody in the process? The reality is they're not required to do anything they don't want to do. They set their own rules. Public procurement's a little bit different. So if I talk about examples from the world of private sector bids, what we have seen actually is companies getting a real level of executive contact, and those insights aren't necessarily shared with other people in that bid. So often it's not a level playing field. And I mean, again, think about what the incumbent does in that situation, whether it's pharmaceutical or IT or hotels. The incumbent will have insights, and they will be having conversations which aren't shared throughout the formal RFP process. So my feeling, and from what I've seen through the research, is that it's not a level playing field, and they're not required to actually provide anything to anybody.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to remind everyone that there is a copy of the slide presentation available at the 3 pages icon up there in case you haven't gotten that. You will receive an email with a link to a playback of this webinar, anytime playback, off the web, or if it's downloadable in a Microsoft format, the WMV format. And also encourage everyone to contact Andy with further questions. And I guess, we are serious about the idea of starting up a group on the side, if anyone wants to start up a group or get involved on discussing these issues. And if you're in a corporate member company, we can help you one-on-one directly, get you matched up with someone who can help you, and you guys can talk about these issues. And Andy, I understand you're always available to talk about this stuff. It's your life.
It is my passion,
yeah.
And I'd love to talk about this to anybody. So please do get in touch.
Thanks, everyone, and just a reminder to fill out the feedback form on your way out. And everyone, please have a good afternoon or good morning.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone.